Picture a church, one of the good ones. Stone walls 4 feet thick, stained glass that turns winter light into something almost miraculous, pews worn smooth by 200 years of devout backsides. Now fill it with the smell of beeswax candles and old hymnals and the particular kind of damp that lives in English stone the way mould lives in English bread, permanently, organically, as though it was always meant to be there. Add a choir singing Purcell at a pitch that makes the high windows vibrate almost imperceptibly. Add the weight of a congregation believing they are in the presence of God. Add a curate standing in the vestry with shaking hands, pressing his forehead against the cold plaster wall, trying to control his breathing before he has to go back out there and read the gospel. That's where we're starting tonight. Not with the grandeur of the church, with the man hiding inside it. This is London, 1854, the year the Crimean War begins, the year Florence Nightingale takes her nurses to Scutari, the year Charles Dickens publishes Hard Times in weekly instalments that all of literate England reads and argues about, the year the broad gauge railway reaches the edge of possibility, the year cholera moves through Soho like a scythe, and a physician named John Snow starts mapping where people die and makes the connection that will eventually save millions of lives. It is a year of enormous, confident, muscular Victorian progress. Steam power, missionary zeal. The British Empire at the apex of its certainty about itself. It is also a year in which a man can be transported to the other side of the world for the crime of being what you are. We're going back there tonight. Not as tourists looking at the cathedrals from the outside, reading about the architectural splendour in a guidebook, admiring the flying buttresses. We're living it. One day, one person. Everything they would have seen, heard, smelled and survived. So I make these history episodes and honestly, I have no idea if anyone actually sleeps to them, or if you're all just people who like lying in the dark learning about the parts of the past that never make it into the school textbooks. The parts that happened in the back rooms, the parts that the official record describes, if it describes them at all, in language so elliptical you have to know what you're looking for to find it. Either way, get comfortable, get your blanket, close your eyes. Here we go. Your name is Reverend Thomas Ashworth. You're 27 years old. You were ordained as a deacon of the Church of England 2 years ago, and you've been a curate at the parish of St. Giles in the Fields for 19 months. You came from Derbyshire, from a market town called Ashborn, where your father is a solicitor, and your mother teaches pianoforte to the daughters of better families than your own, and where everyone expected that you would use your education at Oxford to make something of yourself, which by the standards of Ashborn means either law or the cloth, or possibly medicine, and you chose the cloth, and everyone was proud, and your mother wept pleasantly at your ordination, and your father shook your hand and said you would do well. You're not doing well right now. Right now you're standing in the vestry of St. Giles in the Fields on a grey Tuesday morning in March, and your surplice is slightly damp from the rain. You walked through to get here, and there is a letter in your coat pocket that you have read 4 times and that reads, in a handwriting you do not recognise, slanted and precise and utterly without pity. I know what you are. Meet me Thursday at the sign of the Grapes, Holborn, 6 o'clock, or I will take what I know to the bishop. Come alone, no signature, no name, nothing else. You fold it back into quarters and press your knuckles against your sternum and breathe. The church smells of old wax and cold stone and the faint sweetness of the chrysanthemums that Mrs. Partridge donated for the altar arrangement last Sunday. The chrysanthemums are beginning to turn at the edges. You notice this because you notice everything right now. every sensory detail arriving with a strange sharpness, as though your body has decided that if these are to be your last days of ordinary life, it will at least pay full attention. The bell in the tower above you begins to ring the half hour. 8:30 in the morning. You have 3 sick visits to make before noon, a catechism class at 2, a burial at 4, and a Thursday meeting at 6 o'clock with a person who may be about to destroy you. You pull yourself straight. You pick up your prayer book. You go out into the church. This is what a curate does. He goes out. The church of St. Giles in the Fields sits at the junction of St. Giles High Street and what becomes Tottenham Court Road, which sounds impressive until you understand what St. Giles actually is. St. Giles is the rookery, or rather, it used to be. They've been pulling down the worst of the slums for 2 decades now, routing New Oxford Street straight through the heart of the ancient labyrinth to open up the air and let some of the stench escape. But the people who lived in those courts and passages didn't go anywhere. They just compressed, pressing into what remains, packing themselves 4 and 5 and 8 to a room in the surviving tenements. The parish of St. Giles serves some of the poorest people in London. That was why you chose it. That was what you told yourself, what you told your supervisor at the bishop's office, what you wrote to your parents when you accepted the position under Canon Evelyn Hargreaves. You wanted to do real work. You wanted the ministry to mean something. That was also true. Both things can be true at once. You are learning this. The sick visits take you first to Monmouth Street, where a woman named Mrs. Kehoe is dying of consumption and has been dying for the better part of 3 months in a way that seems almost patient, as though her body is working through a very long administrative process. She is Irish and Catholic by birth, but she accepts your visits because her priest comes only on Sundays and because she is lonely and you read to her. You've been reading her Pilgrim's Progress, which she enjoys more than you might expect, though she interrupted last week to tell you she thought the Slough of Despond was very accurately described. She'd felt just that way when her husband died, so that seemed about right. You liked her for that. You like her very much, which makes the fact that she is dying more difficult than it should be, professionally speaking. Today she is more lucid than last week. She wants to know about the war. You tell her what you know. The alliance with France, the mobilization of troops, the strange moral certainty with which Britain and France are marching to the defense of the Ottoman Empire against Russia, as though this were a simple equation of Christian civilization versus barbarism, rather than the complicated calculation of imperial interest you suspect it actually is. You don't say the last part aloud. You're a clergyman. You keep those thoughts inside, behind the face you have learned to maintain, the face of mild and engaged and sincere concern. You're very good at maintaining a face. Mrs. Kehoe says she hopes the soldiers will be warm enough and offered proper food. She says she knew a man who fought in the Peninsular War, and he never spoke of glory, only of cold and boots that never dried out, and the smell of gangrene in the field hospitals. She says she doesn't understand why men always have to be killing each other, but then, she says, she never understood men generally, and she raises her eyebrows at you in a way that suggests she's making a joke she expects you to appreciate. You smile. The letter in your pocket feels like it weighs as much as a brick. You pray with her. The prayer comes automatically. You know it the way you know your own name, the way you know the street from the church to your lodgings. Muscle memory, habit, the grooves worn by repetition. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. The words are real to you. This is something you want to be understood. The faith is real. The calling was real. These two things do not cancel each other out, no matter how much the world insists they should. Outside on Monmouth Street, the March wind cuts through your coat. The street is already alive with the particular chaos of this neighbourhood. Carts, children, a dog disputing ownership of something in the gutter, two women arguing across a windowsill in rapid Irish that you cannot follow. The air smells of wet stone and horse dung and the smoky sweetness from a bakery somewhere on the corner, something with spices, something warm. You turn your collar up and walk. The second visit is to a man named Samuel Good, who is not sick so much as elderly and proud and unwilling to come to church because he cannot hear the sermon and will not wear his hearing apparatus in public because it is, he says, undignified. He's 83 years old and has lived in St. Giles his entire life, which means he was born into the old rookery when it was still a true labyrinth of passages and courts, when whole extended families lived in windowless cellars, and the mortality rate was such that a man of 83 was not merely old, but essentially miraculous. He was a cobbler, then a shoemaker, then the proprietor of a small shoe repair shop that burned down in 1831, and which he spent the next decade talking about with an intensity that suggested the shop was the defining tragedy of his existence, the thing that broke the arc of what his life might have been. He has a room now in a house on Little White Lion Street. One room. Everything he owns is in it. He sits in a chair by the window with a blanket on his legs and watches the street and reads, very slowly, a Bible with print large enough to be legible to his declining eyes. When you visit, he likes to talk about what the neighbourhood used to be, which means you spend 40 minutes hearing about streets that no longer exist, pubs that burned down, people who died of things that have no names anymore. He touches his Bible constantly while he talks, running his thumb along the spine, though he never opens it when you are there. That is between him and God, apparently. You are just the visitor. You like him too. You sit with him longer than you intended. He tells you about a woman he loved in 1799, a girl who sold watercress from a basket near the church, who died of typhus at 19, and he says it in a voice so matter-of-fact that it's more devastating than grief would be. Just a thing that happened, just a door that closed. He never married, he says. He never much wanted to after. And then he looks at you with his watery, sharp old eyes and says, "You'll not marry either, will you, son? It isn't a question." Your stomach drops. Your face holds absolutely still. "I haven't thought much about it," you say. "The work keeps me occupied." He nods. He says nothing else. He goes back to watching the street. You leave 5 minutes later, walking fast, not running. Never run. You've learned that. The third visit is the hardest. A boy named Peter Sloane, 13 years old, who has been out of school for 6 weeks because of a lung complaint and is going thin and pale in a way that frightens his mother, but that the parish doctor has not been sufficiently concerned about to do more than prescribe rest and broth, which the family can barely afford. You visit him twice a week. You read to him from whichever book he chooses, and he always chooses something improbable. Last week it was a natural history of South America that you found in the charity box, and he asked you questions about anacondas for 45 minutes with a ferocity that was both exhausting and wholly delightful. Today he is worse. You can tell from the moment his mother opens the door. Her face has a particular kind of collapsed tiredness that is different from ordinary exhaustion. He is feverish. He sleeps through most of your visit, though he wakes once and looks at you with glassy eyes and says, "Did you bring the book?" And you say, "Next time, Peter," and he says, all right next time, and goes back to sleep. His mother, standing in the doorway, says, "He's going to die, isn't he?" You say, "I'm going to pray for him, Mrs. Sloane." She says, "That's not what I asked you." You look at her. She's perhaps 35 and looks 50. Her hands are rough from laundry work. She holds herself with a particular exhausted dignity of a woman who has been holding herself together for so long that she's forgotten it's an effort. You say, quietly, "I don't know. I hope not. I'll come back Thursday." Thursday. The word lands in your chest like a stone. You don't go back to the church immediately. You walk instead, which is what you do when you cannot sit still with your thoughts. And London is extraordinarily good for walking, which is one of the reasons you chose it, one of the things you tell yourself when the other reasons feel too complicated. You walk east along High Holborn, past the shops, past the law courts, past the place where they used to hold the Tyburn processions before they moved the gallows to Newgate and then dismantled those too, because even the Victorians occasionally decide that a particular form of spectacle is more barbaric than civilised, though the bar for this decision is set considerably higher than you might expect. The letter is in your pocket. I know what you are. 4 words. Saying everything, saying nothing, not specifying, not needing to specify. Because if you are what the letter implies you are, if someone has seen enough, knows enough, then the word that would complete that sentence is both obvious and unspeakable, even in the private theatre of your own thoughts. You've been trained for years not to think it directly. You think around it, approach it sideways, describe its shape without naming it, in the same way that astronomers in the last century inferred the existence of unknown planets by observing the gravitational distortions in the orbits of the ones they could see. You know something is there by what it bends. The wind off the Thames is working its way up through the city streets. London in March has a particular quality of cold, not the deep, still cold of real winter, but something meaner and more personal, a damp cold that finds the gaps in your coat and presses itself against the back of your neck and refuses to leave. Your shoes are not as waterproof as they should be. The wet seeps through around the left sole, which you've been meaning to get repaired for 3 weeks. Your feet are cold in a way that makes everything else feel colder. You stop at a street stall and buy a cup of coffee, not because you particularly want it, but because you need to put something warm in your hands, and the vendor is a man with no teeth and a cheerful manner who tells you the coffee is excellent, which it is not. It is mostly chicory and something that might charitably be described as coffee adjacent, but it is hot, and you wrap your hands around the tin cup and let the heat move into your palms and try to think clearly. What do you actually know? You know that on the last Friday of January after evensong you went to the back room of a public house called the White Bear on Crown Court off Holborn, which is one of 3 places in this part of London where you know to go when the particular loneliness becomes something heavier than ordinary loneliness. You know that there is a world in those back rooms, a world with its own customs and its own language and its own terrible fragility, a world that exists only because the public world doesn't look directly at it, that survives only in the space between what people suspect and what they are willing to name. You know that you were not careful enough at the White Bear. You spoke to a man. You sat with him for 2 hours. You allowed the conversation to become something it should not have been in a public space. You left together and walked for a quarter hour in the fog before your better judgment retrieved itself, and you made your excuses and walked back alone to your lodgings. You know that someone might have seen any part of that. You drink the bad coffee and watch a cart horse pick its way through the street traffic with the patient intelligence of an animal that has made its peace with its circumstances, and you think, Thursday, 62 hours from now, is from here. The catechism class at 2 is 12 children between the ages of 9 and 15, held in the small vestry room that also serves as a storage space for the Christmas decorations and several boxes of hymnals that need rebinding. The children sit on benches and you sit on a chair that is slightly too small for you, and you work through the questions and answers of the church catechism with a method that is, you think, slightly more interesting than the pure recitation that your predecessor apparently inflicted on these children for 11 years. You ask them what they think the answers mean. You ask them to argue with you. The older ones particularly like this, especially a girl named Agnes Thorne, who is 14, and has the argumentative precision of someone who should really be at university, a future that is completely unavailable to her, which is an injustice you think about sometimes. Today she wants to know why God permits suffering, not abstractly. She wants to know specifically why the children in the rookery who have done nothing wrong die of cholera, while the people in Mayfair who have done nothing particular to deserve their position live well. You tell her what you believe, which is a complicated thing to describe in language that is both honest and appropriate for a church catechism class. You tell her that the church teaches that suffering is not a punishment, that God is not an accountant keeping a ledger of deserve and reward, that the calling of the Christian is not to explain suffering, but to enter into it alongside those who suffer. You tell her this is harder than the other answer. You tell her the harder answer is usually the true one. She looks at you with brown eyes that are taking everything apart and putting it back together in a different order. But why, she says, doesn't he just fix it? I don't know, you say, which is the most honest thing you've said all day. You bury a man named Thomas Wren at 4 o'clock in the church's small graveyard, which is mostly full. They'll have to use the new municipal cemetery for most burials soon. There simply isn't space. And Thomas Wren was a labourer aged 51 who died of something that began as a chest cold and became pneumonia, and became the end. And his wife stands at the grave with their 3 adult children and 2 grandchildren and does not cry, which you have observed is quite common, that often the people who grieve hardest show it least in the public ritual. They save it for somewhere private and later. You say the words. They are the same words for everyone, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life. The earth rattles on the coffin lid. The grandchildren, too young to understand what is happening, press against their mothers. The March wind pushes at your surplice. Afterward, walking back to your lodgings on Museum Street, a room on the 2nd floor of a house kept by a Mrs. Dowd, a widow with a cat and an absolute lack of curiosity about her lodger's business, which you value more than she could possibly know. You find yourself doing mathematics, not the commercial mathematics of the merchant shop, the kind of addition and subtraction that determines whether a trade survives or fails. A different calculation, the mathematics of risk, of exposure, of what it would mean if the letter's author follows through. The Reverend Thomas Ashworth, curate, would cease to exist. You understand this with a clarity that is almost physical, like pressing a finger against a bruise, not because of prison, though prison is a possibility. The law has not formally abolished the penalty of transportation for sodomy, though the last actual transportation for it was, you believe, in the 1840s, and the death penalty has not been applied for 20 years. But the law remains what it is, and what it is a noose, even when the noose is rarely tightened. But even before the law, before any official action, the life you have built, the one that contains Mrs. Kehoe and old Mr. Good and Peter Sloane and Agnes Thorne's ferocious questions, would end. The living would be revoked. Your bishop, who is a good and precise man who cares enormously about the reputation of his diocese, would have no choice. The parish would be scandalised. Your family in Derbyshire would be destroyed. Your father's position as a solicitor depends on his respectability in ways that are more fragile than they appear from the outside. And for what? For sitting with a man in a back room and talking for 2 hours? For walking in the fog? You have done nothing, you tell yourself. And then, more honestly, you have done nothing yet. There is a difference between those sentences that you're acutely aware of and that awareness itself is a kind of evidence. Mrs. Dowd's house smells of boiled cabbage and coal smoke, and the particular smell of her cat, who is named Cromwell, and who treats the entire household with the settled disdain of someone who owns the premises but permits others to inhabit it on sufferance. You hang your coat on the hook in the hall. You go upstairs. Your room is small and clean, the kind of room that looks neat because it contains almost nothing. A bed, a desk, a bookcase with your theology books, and your collection of natural history pamphlets that you buy from the second-hand stalls on the Strand, a small fireplace currently unlit because coal costs money, a window that looks out onto the backs of the buildings on High Holborn. In winter you can see, if you lean out at the right angle, a slice of sky between rooftops that in certain lights is beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with the noise and smell and density of the city below it. You sit at your desk, you take out the letter, you read it for the 5th time, you turn it over, looking for anything you might have missed. The paper is ordinary, the kind available from any stationer's shop. The ink is ordinary. The handwriting, as you said, is slanted and precise and educated, which tells you something about the person. This is not someone illiterate, not a chance street encounter that got passed along. This is someone who can write fluently and whose purpose is legible in every controlled, careful stroke. This is a professional, or at least someone who has thought about this carefully. You open the bottom drawer of your desk. Under a copy of Keeble's Christian Year, the poetry, not the theology, which tells you something about your own private taste that you have never shared with anyone, is a small leather notebook in which you keep nothing incriminating, by which you mean nothing that an outside reader could interpret definitively as evidence of anything. But you use it to record your own thoughts, in a handwriting that is slightly smaller than your usual script, and that sometimes, when you read it back, surprises you with its directness. You don't write in it tonight. You sit with it in your hands and look at the wall. Canon Evelyn Hargreaves comes to mind. He almost always does, when things become difficult. He is your direct superior, the man who selected you for this curacy, the man who has been, over the past 19 months, the closest thing you have found to a person who sees you clearly and does not flinch. He is 52 years old, a canon of the Cathedral of St. Paul's by appointment, and a priest of St. Giles in the Fields by inclination. He has taken no more prestigious position in the church despite being offered several, because he told you once he finds the work of an actual parish more interesting than the work of an ecclesiastical institution, and because he is a man of private means sufficient to make ambition unnecessary. He is tall and thin, with the slightly stooped posture of someone who has spent a lifetime bending to other people's height, with silver hair worn slightly longer than fashion recommends, and eyes of an indeterminate colour that in certain lights appears green and in others grey. And he has a quality of attention that is the rarest thing you know, the quality of actually listening to what is said rather than to what is expected to be said. He is also, you're almost certain, what you are. You have never spoken of it directly. This is the rule, the universal unspoken rule of this double life. You do not speak of it directly, not in any space that is not absolutely sealed, not to anyone you're not entirely certain of, and you are almost certain of Canon Hargreaves and not completely certain, because you have learned that almost and completely are separated by a distance that contains, in some cases, the rest of your life. You're going to have to tell him about the letter. You cannot handle this alone, and he is the only person you trust enough to tell. The thought of that conversation sits in your chest with a specific weight, not terror exactly. Something more like the feeling before a difficult sermon, the knowledge that you are about to say something that cannot be unsaid, that will change the air between you and another person permanently, and that you are going to have to stand there and let it happen. You go downstairs for supper. Mrs. Dowd serves you a plate of something that is theoretically beef and practically mostly turnip, with bread and a small jug of weak beer. She does this every evening with the efficiency of someone who's made this meal, or one very like it, approximately 8,000 times. She asks you if you had a good day, because she asks this every evening as well, and you say it was full, which is what you always say, and she nods, which is what she always does, and you eat your supper in the small dining room that is also her parlour and her sitting room and occasionally her sewing room, with Cromwell the cat watching you from his chair with the judgment of a small and furry magistrate. After supper you go back to your room and you try to read. The book open on your desk is Frederick Denison Morris's Theological Essays, which has caused considerable controversy since its publication last year, because Morris argues, among other things, that eternal punishment may not be as straightforwardly eternal as most of the Church has always insisted, that the Greek word aionios might mean something more like of the age of this particular spiritual condition than the simple forever that most translations render it. He has been dismissed from his professorship at King's College for this. You find it one of the most interesting pieces of theology published in your lifetime. You have shared this opinion with exactly one person. Tonight you cannot concentrate on Morris. The words slide off your attention like water off glass. You read the same paragraph 4 times and retain nothing. You close the book. You light a second candle and pull your coat back on because the room is cold, and you sit in the chair by the window and look out at the back of the building across the narrow lane, where a woman in a lighted window is ironing something, the flat iron moving in long, confident strokes. Her face bent to the work, with a concentration so complete she seems to exist in a different dimension from the one that contains you and your letter. You watch her for a while. The rhythmic movement of her ironing is almost calming. The light from her window is warm and steady. The city's nighttime sounds come up from below. Somewhere, a late coal cart. Further off, a tavern voice lifting for a moment above the general undertone. The clip of horses' hooves on the wet stone. The particular resonance of London at night, that bass note of 500,000 lives continuing, undeterred, unavoidable. You think about Thursday. You think about the man you met at the White Bear. His name was Edmund Calder, and he worked as a compositor in a printing house near Clerkenwell, setting type for legal documents and periodical publications, and he had the particular hands of someone who does precise manual work. Ink stained at the edges of the nails, very slightly roughened but not coarse, the hands of someone who works with small, careful movements rather than heavy labour. He was perhaps 25. He came from Bath originally, from a family of Methodist shopkeepers who had, he told you with a very small private smile, been somewhat surprised by the directions his life had taken. He had dark hair and a way of sitting that was very still, very contained, as though he was used to taking up no more space than strictly necessary. You talked about Maurice. Actually, you talked about Maurice. He had read the theological essays, knew the controversy, had an opinion. You talked about Keble too, and about whether Tractarianism had ultimately helped or hurt the Church's relationship with the ordinary poor, and about the theology of work, and about a lecture on geology you had both apparently attended at the Royal Institution without knowing the other was there. You talked for 2 hours, and the world outside the back room became less present than the world inside the conversation, which is perhaps the most dangerous thing that can happen, that complete absorption, because it makes you forget to watch the edges. You are careless. You haven't seen him since. You don't know his direction. You didn't exchange that information because the rules of this world include never exchanging information you don't absolutely need to, because the fewer threads, the less the unravelling can spread. You don't know his life beyond what he told you that evening. You don't know if he received a letter too. The candles burn down. At some point you move from the chair to the bed, still in your coat, too tired to undress properly. You lie on top of the blankets and look at the ceiling and listen to the city, and try not to imagine in detail the various futures that are now possible. There is no use in imagining them in detail. They are all the same shape. The letter, the meeting, the man who wrote it, the question of what he wants and what you can give him and what happens either way. You fall asleep eventually into a sleep that is grey rather than restful, the kind of sleep that doesn't quite release you, but only holds you at a slight distance from consciousness, so that the church bell that rings at midnight comes through as something half real and half dream, and you fold it into whatever the dream is and sink further. And the letter stays in your coat pocket, waiting, patient as a trap. In the morning the world is still there. This surprises you slightly every morning. The world's persistence is something you have not entirely made your peace with. You sit on the edge of the bed and your feet find the cold floor, and you make the small inventory of your body, the slight ache in your shoulders from yesterday's walking, the gummy eyes, the dry mouth, the weight that settles in your chest when you remember the letter, though for 1/2 second on waking you'd forgotten it, and that 1/2 second was the freest you felt in 2 days. The basin of water on the washstand is cold in the way that early March water is cold, not the brutal cold of January, but a cold that has opinions, that tells you this is still winter, regardless of the calendar's claims about the season. You wash your face, and the cold water on your forehead sharpens your thoughts in the way nothing else does, snaps you into the present, into the specific temperature of right now rather than the abstract terror of Thursday. You dress in your clerical black. It takes, as it does every morning, perhaps 4 minutes. The routine of it is a mercy. White collar bands, black coat, black trousers, shoes that are dry today because you stuffed them with newspaper last night to draw out the damp. You look in the small mirror on the washstand and see the face you always see. Unremarkable, Anglican, appropriately grave, and you straighten your collar and you go downstairs for breakfast. Bread and butter and weak tea. Mrs. Dowd talks about a neighbour's dispute with her landlord and a disturbance on the street last night that she witnessed from her bedroom window, and which she describes with the particular relish of someone who has very little entertainment available to them. Cromwell eats from a dish in the corner and maintains his usual posture of majestic indifference. You eat and listen and think about Canon Hargreaves. He will be at the church this morning. Wednesday is his day at St. Giles. He divides his time between here and St. Paul's and a private study day at his house in Bloomsbury, where he writes the theological commentary he has been composing for the past 8 years on the epistles of Paul, specifically on the question of what Paul meant by pneuma, spirit, and how that has been translated and mistranslated and weaponized by the church ever since. You have read some of it, in draft, with his permission. It is extraordinary scholarship and will, he says with his characteristic equanimity, probably not be published in his lifetime, and possibly not for 50 years after, because it says some things that the church is not yet ready to hear. You asked him once if that frustrated him, writing something he knew could not be read yet. He said, "The thinking is its own reward. Truth doesn't require an audience to be true. You go to the church. The morning is grey and wet, the kind of London morning that seems actively reluctant to become a day, that holds on to the half-light of dawn much longer than strictly necessary. The streets smell of wet stone and horse, and the smoke of breakfast fires, all the chimneys of the neighbourhood doing their work. The air above the rooftops crossed with the dark threads of smoke that give London its particular atmospheric weight. A man pushing a barrow of vegetables calls something you don't catch. 2 children run past in apparent joy despite, or perhaps because of, the rain, their boots leaving dark impressions in the mud of the gutter. The church door is heavy oak, iron-banded, swollen slightly with the damp as it always is in wet weather. You put your shoulder to it and opens into the cool, high dimness of the nave. The smell of the place is different in the morning. More raw, without the candles and the bodies of the congregation, more stone and wood and the mineral smell of old mortar. The stained glass throws no colour at this hour, the light outside too weak to activate it, and the windows are just lead and coloured glass. Abstract, decorative, not yet performing their miracle. Canon Hargreaves is in his preferred pew, the one in the north aisle, reading. He does this every Wednesday morning, arrives early, reads for an hour in the quiet of the empty church, which he describes as one of the great luxuries of his position, the ability to sit in a large and silent stone room with a book. He looks up when he hears the door. He has a very specific way of reading a room that you have noticed, that involves a slight pause before he settles his attention on you, as if he is completing a sentence before switching contexts. He closes his book. This morning it is, you can see at a distance, a small volume of Greek, and he says simply, "You look terrible, Thomas." This is perhaps the third thing you love about him, after his mind and his patience, his absolute willingness to state what is obvious. "I received a letter," you say. He's quiet for a moment. He does not ask what kind of letter. He's too intelligent to ask that. "Come and sit down," he says. You sit. The pew is cold through your coat, the wood ancient and slightly rough. The church holds the two of you in its stillness. Somewhere above, a pigeon moves on the roof, the muffled thud of its feet transmitted through the stone, and then silence again. You tell him about the letter. You describe its contents precisely. The 4 words of accusation, the meeting place, the time, the absence of a name. You tell him about the white bear and January, the conversation with Edmund Calder, the moment of carelessness. You tell it briefly, without embellishment, in the language of factual description rather than confession, because this is not a confessional, and you're not confessing. You're explaining a problem to someone you need to help you think. He listens the way he always listens, without changing his expression, without any visible reaction, with his hands folded and his attention completely on you. When you finish, he's quiet for perhaps 20 seconds, long enough to feel like a meaningful silence. Then he says, "When did you receive it?" Yesterday morning, before the sick visits. And you've carried it since? Yes. He nods, very slightly. He looks at the altar, the chrysanthemums, the turning edges. Do you have any idea who might have written it, he says. No. The handwriting isn't familiar. The choice of the grapes at Holborn is interesting. It suggests someone who knows the area. It's not a place where people who want to be seen would go. It's also not a place where someone who didn't know this neighbourhood would naturally choose. Which suggests, Hargreaves says slowly, someone close. The word close lands in the empty church and sits there. Yes, you say. He unfolds his hands, refolds them differently. He has a habit of rearranging his hands when he is thinking, which you have come to recognise as the outward sign of an internal process. The way some people pace or drum their fingers or look at the ceiling. There are several possibilities, he sees, in the tone of someone who has thought about this category of problem before, which is something you are conscious of not asking him about directly. The first is that whoever wrote the letter is genuinely in possession of information sufficient to cause harm and wants money. The second is that they have very little and are bluffing, hoping you'll pay without determining the extent of their knowledge. The third possibility is that this isn't about money at all. What's the third possibility? Someone who wants something else, he says. Influence, position, an introduction to someone you have access to, or simply, someone who wants to cause harm, and payment is not the point. What do I do, you say? And Hargreaves, who has been a priest for 27 years, and who navigates the space between the visible and invisible world with a precision that has always seemed to you almost preternatural, says, you go to the meeting. You think I should go? I think you don't have a choice that doesn't have a worse outcome than going. If you refuse to go, the letter's threat proceeds. If you go, at minimum you discover what is known and what is wanted. Information is always better than ignorance. In the dark you stumble. In the light you can at least see what you're walking into. He looks at you directly. His eyes in this morning light are definitely grey. But you don't go alone, he says. I'll come. The letter specifically says what someone who wants control would say. You're not obligated to give them the terms. A pause. I'll be there at a table near the front. You won't be seen with me, but you'll know I'm there. You look at him. The church holds you both. The cold of the stone and the smell of old wax and the silence that is never quite complete, always threaded with the city's bass note coming through the walls. Have you begin, and then stop. He waits. Have you done this before, you say? Another pause. Not uncomfortable, just precise. Yes, he says. Different circumstances. Long ago. He picks up his Greek text and looks at it briefly, then puts it down again. The blackmailers of this city have been practicing their trade for as long as this particular law has existed. They know their market. They know that the law makes secrecy more valuable than almost any other commodity. His voice is even and measured and contains something underneath the evenness that you don't push at. The important thing is that they need the secret to remain secret. The moment you make it public, the moment you threaten to remove their leverage by removing the shame, they lose everything. That's their weakness. The cure is as bad as the disease, you say? In most cases, yes. He looks at the altar again. The chrysanthemums. Which is why we go on Thursday, and we find out what they want, and then we decide what we can give and what we cannot. And we don't do anything that makes the situation permanently worse. And if what they want is something I cannot give, then we'll think of something else, he says. But let's not borrow that problem yet. You sit there together for a while in the cold, empty church. The pigeon moves again on the roof. Somewhere on the street outside, a woman's voice calls a name repeatedly. Mary, Mary, with the patient exasperation of someone who's been doing this for some time. Thomas, Hargreaves says when the silence is stretched enough. Yes? You're not alone in this. I want you to understand that directly, not in the general theological sense of grace and companionship, though that also. I mean specifically, in this situation, you are not alone. You don't say anything for a moment. Thank you, you say. He nods. He opens his Greek text again. The conversation is over, which is to say, it has concluded, which is different from being finished. You go to the vestry to prepare for the morning. The days between Wednesday and Thursday have the quality of time just before an important examination, or perhaps more accurately just before a verdict. The sense of everything slowed and clarified, made simultaneously more and less real. You conduct the business of the parish with your usual attention, or something so close to it that if there is a deficit, no one remarks on it. You visit Peter Sloane on Wednesday afternoon and find him the same as yesterday, feverish, thin, intermittently conscious. And you sit with him and read from the natural history of South America even though he appears to be asleep, because he may be able to hear, and the anacondas are genuinely remarkable. His mother makes you tea and doesn't ask again about whether he'll die. She asks instead, while you drink it standing in her small kitchen, whether you know why the Crimea, whether you know what England has to do with a war in Turkey. You tell her what you told Mrs. Kehoe, the same diplomatic version. She says, "My Tommy might be called up. He's 21. She says this the way she said everything about her son's illness, flatly, as though emotion is a luxury she has decided not to afford. You don't have anything adequate to say. You tell her you'll pray for him. She says, "Do that then," and takes your cup. On Wednesday evening after supper you walk. This is your usual management of difficult thoughts. You walk until they have been processed sufficiently to be bearable, which sometimes takes 20 minutes and sometimes takes 2 hours. Tonight you walk south toward the Thames through Covent Garden, which at this hour is alive with the theatre crowd arriving and the market workers departing, a crossing of two worlds that London manages with its characteristic simultaneous chaos and indifference. The smell of the flower market lingers even in the evening, cut beneath the coal smoke and the bread and the distant river smell, something sweet and vegetable and slightly rotting at the edges, the way cut flowers always smell eventually. You pass the entrance to the Lyceum and the Adelphi, where the evening performances are beginning, people in good clothes filing through the doors, carriages making the road nearly impassable. The lamplight on the wet street makes everything amber and theatrical, everything a little heightened, a little more like the idea of itself than the thing. You think about the white bear and January, Edmund Calder's hands, ink-stained at the edges of the nails, the way he listened when you talked. The quality of his attention, which reminded you of Hargreaves in its specificity. Not the polite attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the real attention of someone actually following the thought wherever it goes. You'd been talking about the theology of suffering, the question Agnes Thorne asked in Catechism, the question that never entirely resolves, and Edmund had been quiet for a moment and then said, "I think what Maurice means by aionios is not duration at all, but quality. Not a punishment that lasts forever, but a state of being. The eternity is the nature of it, not the length." And you'd looked at him and said, "That's exactly what I think." And the recognition had been so complete it felt dangerous. which it was, which it in fact was. You had not let yourself think too much about Edmund since January. This is a skill you have developed, the skill of not thinking about things, of rerouting attention when it tends towards certain places, of maintaining the face by maintaining the interior beneath it. You're not always successful. Tonight you are not successful. You think, wherever Edmund Calder is tonight, he may be holding a letter identical to yours, or he may not. The letter may be aimed only at you. The blackmailer, if that's what they are, if Thursday confirms that reading, may not know about Edmund, may have seen you leave together but not seen enough to identify him, may have a connection to St. Giles specifically. That makes you the target rather than anyone else. There are too many variables. Hargreaves is right. You go to the meeting, and then you know. You reach the embankment. Not yet the official embankment, which won't be built for another decade. Just the reach of the Thames as it can be accessed from the streets that run down to it. The wharves and stairs and the open foreshore at low tide where the mudlarks work. Picking through what the river leaves behind. The river tonight is high and dark and moving fast, the current visible in the lamplight, the surface troubled. The smell is extraordinary. The Thames in 1854 is not a river you want to smell in summer, when it becomes what will come to be known as the Great Stink. The smell so overpowering that Parliament itself will have to hang curtains soaked in chloride of lime to make the chamber bearable. Tonight in March it is bearable, but only barely. The mixture of tidal mud and sewage and coal tar and the industrial effluent of 1,000,000 lives live directly above it. You stand at the top of one of the river stairs and look out at the water. A barge moves downstream, heavily laden, the single lantern at its stern making a moving point of light in the darkness. The cathedral dome across the river, barely visible in the fog and the lamplight, just a darkness heavier than the surrounding dark. You think about what Hargreaves said. You're not alone. And then you think, but the nature of this particular life is that the aloneness is structural. It is not a failure of relationship or of reaching out. It is built into the shape of the thing, into the fact that the thing cannot be fully named or fully entered or fully shared, and that the people who know it of themselves carry it each in their own private container. And when two containers are adjacent, you can sometimes sense the resonance, the frequency that matches, and you can build a kind of connection from that recognition. But the containers remain separate. You are always, at the most fundamental level, alone with this. The barge disappears downstream. You turn and walk home. Thursday. The Grapes at Holborn is a public house on a street that runs off the main road, narrow and unprepossessing, the kind of place that is designed not to be noticed. The sign above the door is faded. The grapes have been rained into something more like a dark stain than a recognizable fruit. The window is small and dirty. Inside, when you push through the door at 3 minutes before 6, it is warm and dark and smells of ale and tobacco, and the particular smell of accumulated evenings, the residue of 10,000 conversations. It is not crowded. The clientele tonight is perhaps 12 people, scattered at tables, some in groups, some alone. A fire at the back, a barman with red hands and no particular expression. You order ale because you need something to hold, and because a man sitting alone in a public house without a drink is conspicuous, which is the last thing you want. You carry the tankard to a table in the middle of the room and sit down facing the door and wait. You see Hargreaves. He is already there, in a corner near the window, with a book open on the table. He doesn't look up when you enter. He has a cup of something at his elbow. He looks like precisely what he is. A well-dressed man of middle age in a public house with a book, someone who has stopped in for a quiet drink and reads while he waits. There is nothing remarkable about him. He is invisible in the way that the confident and unhurried always are. The clock above the bar ticks to 6. The door opens. The man who comes in is perhaps 40. He's not what you expected, which is perhaps the point. You expected something physically menacing or something overtly furtive. But what you get is a man in a decent grey coat who might be an office clerk, a solicitor's assistant, a modest professional of some kind. He has a long face and light eyes, and the look of someone who's very precise about money in both directions. Neither extravagant nor genuinely poor. Calibrated exactly to the socio-economic position he has chosen to occupy. He scans the room with a practiced efficiency, finds you, and sits down across from you with the smooth confidence of someone doing something they have done before. He doesn't introduce himself. "Reverend Ashworth," he says. "Yes," you say. "You know why you're here." "I know why you say I'm here," you say. Hargreaves told you this. Don't concede more than you have to. Don't confirm what they haven't confirmed. Let them spend their information first. I'd like to understand what you think you know and what you think it's worth. He looks at you for a moment with something that might be mild appreciation. "Direct," he says. "Good. I prefer direct." He folds his hands on the table. His nails are clean and cut very precisely. He looks at you steadily. "I know that you attend gatherings of a particular kind," he says. "I know that you were observed at the White Bear in January in company of a specific kind. I know that you have been observed at least twice in other locations relevant to this matter, including—" He names a place in Southwark that you know of, have visited once more carefully than the White Bear, and the naming of it produces a cold feeling in your stomach that has nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "I know who you are in the church. I know who your bishop is, and I know what the consequences of a communication to your bishop would be." He stops. He waits. "And?" you say. "And nothing dramatic," he says. "I'm not interested in drama. I'm interested in a very simple arrangement. You're in a position to provide introductions to certain people at certain ecclesiastical levels. That would benefit a business associate of mine. Not illegal business, not anything that would compromise your reputation in the conventional sense. An introduction, the opening of a door that is currently closed." He names a name you recognize, a name in the diocese, a man who controls several appointments and who has connections to the Board of Charitable Works and whose good opinion is worth a very specific kind of commercial access. "I want a meeting arranged through you." You stare at him. "That's all," you say. "That's all, for now." And those last two words, "for now," settle into the conversation like a stone into deep water, felt more than heard, their implications spreading outward in every direction. "And if I arrange this meeting," you say, "you have what you've described. What prevents you from asking for another meeting, another introduction, another arrangement?" He looks at you with the patience of someone being asked a question they've been expecting. "Nothing," he says. "Which is why you're going to have to decide whether what I've described is a price you're willing to pay, indefinitely, for an arrangement of this kind, or whether there's another approach available to you." You look at him. The fire crackles at the back of the room. The barman collects glasses from a nearby table. Two men at the bar discuss something about horses. "What's your name?" you say. He smiles, very slightly. "No," he says. You drink your ale. Your hands are entirely steady, which surprises you. because your heart is doing something complicated and your mind is running through several calculations simultaneously, but the hands are steady. You notice this. You file it away for later consideration. I'll need time to think, you say. You have until Sunday morning, he says. If I've had no communication from you by Sunday morning, I'll write to the bishop on Sunday afternoon. He stands smoothly, without hurry, buttons his coat, looks down at you with that light-eyed precision. I have no personal quarrel with you, Reverend, he says. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. I'd strongly recommend treating it as such. He walks out of the grapes without looking back. You sit for perhaps 2 minutes, finishing your ale, not moving. Then you stand and walk to Hargreaves's corner. He doesn't look up until you sit down. Then he looks at you. Tell me everything, he says. You tell him. Every word you can remember. The name the man wanted the introduction to, which Hargreaves receives with a particular stillness that tells you he already has thoughts about it. The for now, the Sunday deadline. The name he wants, Hargreaves says when you finish. The introduction. Do you know him well? I know of him. Our contact is limited. He looks at his book, closed now on the table. What he's actually asking for is access to patronage. The man he names controls ecclesiastical appointments that are worth money, not directly but indirectly through the charitable organisations. It's not an unusual form of corruption in the church. It simply usually proceeds through different channels. He looks at you. He has information sufficient to motivate you. The question is whether the information is sufficient to make you the best conduit for what he wants, or whether there's someone else who could provide the same access more easily. You're saying he may not need me. I'm saying his calculation may be based on incomplete information about who else is available to him, which might be useful. Or it might not be useful at all, and I might just have to decide whether to comply with an open-ended blackmail arrangement. Yes, Hargreaves says, that's also the situation. Outside, the Holborn traffic continues. The carts and horses and evening crowds, all of it indifferent to the conversation happening in this corner. You look at the window at the dirty glass and the darkness beyond it, and you think, 4 days to Sunday. There's something else, Hargreaves says. Yes, the place he named in Southwark. You should not go back there. I know. And the White Bear, at least for the foreseeable future. I know. He's quiet for a moment. These arrangements always feel at first as though they constitute the entirety of the problem, as if the blackmailer is the whole situation. He picks up his book, turns it in his hands. They're not. They're a symptom. The situation is older than this and larger than this and will outlast both this man and his business associate. He sets the book down again. I want you to understand that what he's exploiting is not a weakness. I want you to understand that very clearly. It's a law that is wrong, applied by people who are imperfect, to men who are no less faithful or decent than anyone else in this room. You look at him. He meets your gaze steadily. It's a position I've arrived at, he says, through many years of trying to think honestly about what the faith actually requires, and I find, consistently, that it does not require this, that the weight placed on this particular human variation is not proportional to any reasonable reading of the gospel. But, he picks up his cup, I also understand that we live in the world that exists, not the world we think should exist. And in the world that exists, the practical question before you on Sunday morning is a practical one. He drinks. You sit there together in the corner of the grapes, while London moves around you outside. What would you do? You say. He doesn't answer immediately. He considers. I would find out, he says finally, everything I could about the business associate being served here, what he needs the access for, whether there are people in the diocese who are already aware of him and his interests, and what their opinion of those interests might be. And I would consider whether there is a way to make the information known that removes my usefulness from the equation entirely. Tell someone about him before he can tell anyone about me. In the most carefully managed version of that, yes, he tilts his head slightly. The risk is obvious. The risk is that the conversation you're trying to control gets away from you. But the greater risk, I would argue, is an arrangement without a terminus. For now is two of the most dangerous words in the English language when said in that context. You leave the grapes an hour later, separately, by unspoken agreement, Hargreaves first, and you walk back through the evening streets toward Museum Street and Mrs. Dowd's and the cold room, and the letter still in your coat pocket, even though you have now memorized it, and it no longer contains information, only weight. The fog has come in while you were inside. Not the thick yellow fog of a cold day, just a sea fog moving in from the estuary, blurring the edges of the gas lamps so each one has a halo. The streets are less crowded now, the evening commerce settling, the respectable classes retreating indoors, the other kind of evening beginning in the spaces left behind. You pass the entrance to a court off Drury Lane where a woman sits on a step smoking a pipe, and watching the street with professional attention. You pass a group of young men whose noise has the quality of ale and a beginning of the night. You pass a boy selling newspapers, his voice going hoarse from the evening's calling. You think about Edmund Calder, wherever he is, whether he received a letter, whether he's sitting in a cold room somewhere with his ink-stained hands and his precise mind, running the same calculations you have been running for the past 2 days. The thought of him in that situation, with no Hargreaves in the corner of his grapes, no one who understands both the danger and its full dimensions, that thought moves through you with a sharpness that is different from the fear for yourself, heavier in a different way. You don't know how to find him. That is the rule. The rule exists for good reasons, and the good reasons have not changed. You walk. In the morning, Friday, 2 days from Sunday, you do the work of the parish. This is its own kind of discipline. The work, the visiting, the catechism, the correspondence with the bishop's office about the confirmation classes scheduled for April, the repairs to the vestry roof that have been needed since before you arrived, and that require a sequence of letters to the church wardens who control the funds. The correspondence is ordinary and specific and requires your full attention to do correctly, which is its gift. You cannot think about Sunday while you're writing a detailed letter about the vestry roof. The roof requires sentences. The sentences require you to be present in them. You are present in the sentences. Saturday is different. Saturday you have more time, less structure, and the thought of Sunday expands to fill the available space. You go to the museum. The British Museum is 5 minutes from your lodgings, and you have a habit of going there when your thoughts require something exterior to hold them. The reading room is not yet the great domed space it will become. The dome is under construction, the iron framework visible through the temporary covering, the reading room in its older configuration still usable, still filled with the particular quality of a deep concentration that a room full of people not talking produces. You read for 3 hours, or appear to read. Your eyes move over the pages, the words proceed, some of them sink in. You're reading Froude's History of England, the parts about the Reformation, about the moment in the 16th century when the Church of England was made, and you find yourself thinking about the strangeness of an institution built on a king's desire to divorce his wife, eventually producing, 300 years later, Men like Hargreaves, men who have thought their way to positions of such theological subtlety that they exist at a considerable angle to the institution's official self-understanding, and who continue to serve the institution anyway, because they love what it can be when it is closest to what it was meant to be. On Saturday afternoon you write 2 letters. The first is to Hargreaves, brief, asking him to make inquiries, carefully, obliquely, through the channels he has, which are more extensive than yours, about the business associate named at the Grapes. What the man's interests are, who he deals with in the diocese, whether anyone with relevant knowledge already has an opinion of him. The second letter you do not send. You write it and then read it and then fold it and then put it in the bottom drawer under Keeble's Christian Year. It is addressed to no one, it says, in the private compressed script you use in your notebook. I think I know who wrote the letter, not the man at the Grapes. He didn't write it. Someone who knows this neighbourhood and knows the church, and perhaps knows me more specifically than I would like. And I think I know who can verify that, and I think that knowing might change what's available to me. But I might be wrong. I am often wrong about the things I most want to be right about. You are wrong about very few things. Sunday morning. The 8 o'clock service at St. Giles in the Fields. You vest in the vestry alone. The verger, Mr. Hopkins, has a cold that you can hear from the nave, a productive Victorian cough that suggests this might develop into something that will concern you pastorally within the fortnight. The supplice is crisp, laundered by whoever it is that launders the church's linen, a woman you have never met but whose work you appreciate in the way you appreciate all invisible labour, more, perhaps, than you appreciate the visible kind, having grown more conscious of invisibility as a condition over the past 3 years. The congregation at the 8 o'clock is small. The parish's devout core, the people who come because they have always come, because the rhythms of the church are as structural to their weeks as the rhythms of work. You know all of them. Mrs. Partridge with the chrysanthemums, old Mr. Good, who's come after all despite his hearing difficulties, who sits near the front with the determined expression of a man who has decided to be present even if he can't follow the words. A family of 5 who moved into the parish 2 months ago from somewhere in Essex, and who attend with the slightly careful attention of people establishing their social position in a new neighbourhood. You read the Gospel, Mark chapter 1, the calling of the first disciples. They were mending their nets, and he called them, and they left their nets immediately and followed. You have preached on this passage before, and said the usual things. The immediacy of the response, the willingness to leave the familiar, the nature of discipleship as a radical departure from the previous life. Today, standing at the lectern in the cold church with the March light finally finding some colour in the east window, you hear it slightly differently. They left their nets. They left what they had built, what they depended on, what defined them in the eyes of everyone who knew them, because there was something calling them that seemed more real than any of it. You preach briefly, as you always do at the 8 o'clock. 10 minutes. The sermon is prepared, is competent, says the expected things with the expected eloquence. You hear yourself saying the words and think, this is what it means to have a practice as distinct from a performance. The practice continues even when the interior life that animates it is elsewhere. This isn't dishonesty. It's something more like what a craftsman does when they're tired. The hands know the work even when the mind is somewhere else entirely. After the service in the vestry, Mr. Hopkins produces his Victorian cough and tells you that a young man came to the church door yesterday asking for you. Did not leave a name. Said he would try again. You are very still for a moment. What did he look like, you say? Hopkins describes him. Dark hair, moderately well dressed, perhaps 25, ink stains on his fingers. Edmund Calder found you, or found the church, which amounts to finding you, which means Edmund Calder received a letter, or knows about yours, or simply wants to speak to you, or all three, all of which require a response that cannot be sent because you have no address for him, and none of which can wait until he decides to try again, whenever that might be. Hargreaves arrives for the 10 o'clock service. You catch him before the vestry fills and tell him about the visitor. He listens. He says, "The printing house near Clerkenwell. You said he was a compositor there." "Yes." "Then he can be found." "I don't want to send someone to his place of work." "No, but knowing the general location is a start." He straightens his surplice. "Let me think about it. The 10 o'clock is fuller. The usual Sunday congregation, people who have come from across the parish and a few from further out who prefer Hargreaves's preaching. He is known for it, the way he is known among a specific kind of reader for his theological writing, among people who pay attention to sermons. Today he preaches on the same gospel text, which is an irony not lost on you. You gave the 8 o'clock congregation the conventional reading, and now you're going to hear his. His reading is not conventional. He says they were mending their nets. This is the detail Matthew gives us that Mark omits. They were in the act of repair, of maintenance, of doing the necessary work of keeping existing structures functional. And this is the moment they were called. Not in a moment of idleness or readiness, but in the act of ordinary maintenance. And the departure, he says, was not from the work itself, not from the labour of mending. They took those skills with them, the patience, the precision, the willingness to sit with broken things and make them whole. What they left behind was the specific context, the defined role, the net as a net rather than the net as a way of understanding how things hold together and how they fail and how they can be repaired. He doesn't look at you during this sermon. He never looks at specific people when he preaches, which is one of the ways he maintains the quality of speaking to everyone and no one simultaneously. But you sit in the choir stall and feel the sermon working in you the way good sermons do, finding the space between what you already know and what you haven't quite articulated, expanding it. Sunday morning passes. No letter arrives from you to the unnamed blackmailer, because you wrote no such letter, because you chose Hargreaves's approach. Do not respond. Find out what you can first. Do not give them more information than they already have by demonstrating that you're afraid. Sunday afternoon. You've decided, sitting in the cold vestry, that the for now is the thing, that it cannot be managed by compliance, that Hargreaves is right. You need to understand the business associate, what he wants and from whom he wants it, before you decide whether giving it to him is worse or better than the alternative. You walk to Bloomsbury, to Hargreaves's house, because he's given you a standing invitation, and because you have nowhere else you want to be today, and because his study contains one of the better private libraries in the neighbourhood, and an easy chair in which you've fallen asleep twice before, without either of you finding this remarkable. He answers the door himself. He has a woman who comes to cook and clean 3 days a week, but not Sundays. His house smells of books and coal fires and a faint sweetness that comes from a bowl of dried orange peel he keeps on the hall table, for reasons he has never explained. The hallway is lined with bookshelves, which tells you everything you need to know about the priorities of the household. "Come in," he says. "I've been writing." The study is at the back of the house. 2 tall windows looking onto a small garden, currently brown and winter-stripped. A desk covered in paper, the manuscript of the commentary on Numa, or rather the current section of it, which has been underway since before you arrived in London. Bookshelves on 3 walls, the books so densely packed that some of them are shelved horizontally on top of the vertical rows. A fireplace with a good fire, the easy chair. He pours sherry from a decanter on the mantelpiece. You sit, the fire is warm on your legs. "I've heard something," he says, settling into the chair across from you. He tells you what he's found through the careful inquiries he described on Thursday. The business associate, whose name he has now confirmed, having identified the man through a mutual contact in the diocese, is involved in a charitable organisation that is currently seeking significant funding from ecclesiastical sources. The funding in question is for an institution in Bermondsey, a home for destitute women, which sounds on its surface like an entirely praiseworthy cause, and which may even be exactly what it sounds like. But there is question among certain people in the diocese about the management of the charitable funds and about whether previous institutional funds have been entirely accounted for. Not an accusation, a question. The kind of question that makes a man need very much to rebuild trust with the people who control the money. So what he needs, you say, is someone to vouch for him. More precisely, he needs the conversation to happen at all. The introduction is the first step. After that, his case lives or dies on its own merits. And the man at the grapes is his agent, almost certainly. You drink your sherry. The fire settles. There's a simpler version of this, you say. If someone in the diocese is already asking questions about the charitable funds, then the information, rather than the introduction, may be the relevant asset, Hargreaves says. And who has the information and who controls it is a different question from who controls my introduction. Yes. And the man at the grapes doesn't necessarily know that anyone in the diocese already has doubts. He may think the primary obstacle is access, not credibility. He may. Hargreaves looks at the fire, in which case the leverage he has over you may be less decisive than he believes. If the door he wants opened is already, in the relevant person's view, closed for reasons that have nothing to do with your introduction, then what he has over you doesn't unlock it. But he can still use what he has. Yes, but the calculation changes. You think about this. The fire crackles. Outside the study window the garden is entirely still, the stripped branches of the small fruit tree motionless, the light failing fast now, the sky over Bloomsbury going the particular shade of deep grey that is London's version of sunset. "I need to find Edmund Calder, you say." Hargreaves looks at you. "Yes," he says, after a moment. "You probably do." The Clerkenwell printing houses are not difficult to locate in general terms, though there are several of them, and the area is complex enough that it takes some navigation. You go on Monday morning before the sick visits, taking the longer route through Gray's Inn Lane, turning north toward Clerkenwell Green. The area smells of ink and paper. It is London's printing district, has been for a century, an entire neighbourhood shaped around the press, the type, the machinery of text. The air is different here than in St. Giles, sharper, with the metallic sharpness of ink cutting through the coal smoke and the hoarse. You find the printing house that is most likely to employ a compositor of Edmund's description. It takes 3 inquiries, 2 of which send you in slightly different directions, before a stationer's boy points you to a building on Clerkenwell Close that does, he says, legal documents mostly, which matches what Edmund told you at the White Bear. The building is substantial. 3 stories with large windows on the upper floors to let in the light for the compositor's work. A sign above the door, Finch and Brother Printers. You go in. The ground floor is a counter and a waiting area, behind which you can hear the rhythmic, mechanical sound of the press. A clerk looks up when you enter. You say you're looking for a man named Edmund Calder, that you are a clergyman, that you have a private message for him. The clerk looks at your collar and your coat and makes the rapid assessment of social position that is constant and universal in Victorian England, and finds you, correctly, to be what you appear, a Church of England clergyman of the curate variety, respectable but not elevated, safe to deal with. He disappears into the back. You wait. The sound of the press continues, rhythmic and dense like a mechanical heartbeat. Edmund comes out from the back. He sees you, and the expression that crosses his face, very briefly, in the second before he controls it, is relief. Relief and something underneath it that is more complex, something that has the quality of a long breath finally let out. Reverend Ashworth, he says, formally, for the clerk's benefit. Mr. Calder, you say, equally formally. I wonder if you might have a moment. There's a matter I need to discuss with you regarding. You pause, reach for something plausible, find it. The parish literacy programme. We're looking for volunteers with printing experience. It is a barefaced lie. You say it with perfect clerical steadiness. Edmund says, Certainly, Reverend. I'll get my coat. You wait for him outside in the Clerkenwell Close, in the watery Monday morning light. The smell of ink follows him out when he comes through the door, coat on, hat in his hand. You begin walking without discussion away from the building toward the green. When you're a sufficient distance, 2 streets, then a third into a quieter lane, Edmund says, You got a letter. Yes, you say. So did I. You walk in silence for a moment. When, you say. Wednesday. Same terms as yours, I imagine. Meeting place. Deadline. He turns his hat in his hands as he walks. His face is controlled, professionally neutral, the face of someone who has had several days to practice not showing what he's feeling. But the hands, turning the hat, give him away. I went to St. Giles on Saturday. You weren't there. I was at the museum. I left my name with the old verger. He described you. Edmund nods. He looks at the ground as he walks, then up at the lane ahead of them, then briefly at you. Who is it? He says. A man at a public house in Holborn. I've spoken to him. He's an agent, not the principal. What he wants is an introduction, a meeting in the diocese that his employer can't get through normal channels. For what purpose? You explain what Hargreaves found out. The charitable organisation, the questions about the funds, the man's need to rebuild trust. Edmund listens with the same quality of attention you remember from the White Bear. Tracking, processing, not interrupting. And you, he says when you finish, what are you going to do? I don't know yet, you say. There may be a way to remove his leverage by making what he has irrelevant rather than by complying with it. But it requires knowing more than I currently know, and it carries its own risks. The same risks as not complying. Similar in kind, different in degree. The alternative to compliance is essentially to remove the value of what he has, which means, in some version, that what he has becomes known through other channels before he can use it himself. You walk. A cat crosses the lane ahead of you, pauses, regards you both with the sovereign disinterest that all London cats maintain as a default. It's not a safe approach. No, Edmund says, it's not. You stop at the end of the lane where it opens onto a slightly wider street. You face each other. He looks at you with his dark eyes and his controlled face, and his hands that have stopped turning the hat and are holding it still. I have a friend, you say, a senior member of the church who understands this situation in all its dimensions and who is helping me navigate it. He's looking into the background of the principle. If we find what I think we may find, there may be a way to approach the relevant people in the diocese with information that effectively removes the agent's leverage by giving them a reason to decline the introduction on grounds entirely unrelated to either of us. Edmund is quiet. He turns this over. That would require, he says carefully, trusting your friend very completely. Yes, you say. And I do. He looks at you for a moment longer. Then he says, and what do you need from me, you think? Nothing immediately. I wanted you to know. I wanted you to... You stop. Find the precise word. I wanted you to know you weren't alone in this. It is Hargreaves's phrase. You realise as you say it. Given to him by Hargreaves, now given forward. Edmund's face changes slightly. The controlled neutral gives way for a moment to something more direct, something that is not quite named but is in the vicinity of gratitude and something warmer than gratitude. I'm at Finch and Brother, he says. Monday through Friday, 7 until 6. Saturday mornings. A brief pause. If you need me. You both know that if you need me, and what it contains is not only about the blackmail. You both know this, and neither of you says so. Thank you, you say. He puts his hat on. He turns and walks back toward Clerkenwell Close, and you watch him go, and then you turn and walk south toward St. Giles, and the Monday morning moves around you, the city doing what it always does, proceeding indifferent, massive, magnificent, terrible. The days that follow have a quality of suspended motion, the way a wheel continues to turn by its own momentum before the mechanism engages. You do the work. Mrs. Kehoe is slightly better on Tuesday, the disease having retreated a fraction, as it sometimes does before it advances again. You know this pattern, have seen it before, but you do not say so. You read her another chapter of Pilgrim's Progress. She asks what you think of the figure of Faithful, who is burned alive in Vanity Fair for refusing to deny his faith. You say you think Faithful is admirable, and that Bunyan understands something very accurate about the price of consistency. She says she thinks Faithful was a bit of a fool for not keeping his mouth shut, and she says it with great affection. Peter Sloane is the same, neither better nor worse, which the doctor now says might be the beginning of stability. You read the Anacondas to him on Thursday, and he is awake for some of it, and when you describe the Anaconda's method of prey, the constriction, the patience, the inescapability of the pressure, he opens his eyes and says with perfect 13-year-old solemnity, "That's like a lot of things, isn't it?" You say yes. He closes his eyes again. You read the rest of the chapter to him anyway. Agnes Thorne, at the Friday Catechism, asks why the Church doesn't ordain women. You tell her the official answer, tradition, theological consensus, the practice of the early Church. You tell it correctly. And then she looks at you with those taken-apart eyes and says, "But you don't think that's the whole answer, do you?" And you say, "Agnes, I think it's complicated." And she says, "That means no." You say, "You're going to be a formidable person." She says, "I already am. On Thursday of the second week, 12 days since the letter, 5 days past the Sunday deadline, during which time nothing from the unnamed blackmailer has occurred, which is either because he is playing a longer game or because he received information from Hargreaves's quiet inquiries that made him reconsider the value of the particular leverage he holds. Hargreaves sends you a note asking you to come to his study on Friday evening. Friday evening in Bloomsbury. The dried orange peel, the bookshelves, the fire, the sherry. Hargreaves sits across from you with his hands in their thinking fold. He tells you what he's found. The charitable organisation in Bermondsey has been investigated, informally and quietly, by a member of the Diocesan Finance Committee over the past 3 months. The questions about the accounts are more serious than was initially apparent. The man whose introduction the business associate wanted is already, through this committee member's work, aware of the problems and has decided not to meet with the organisation's principals under any circumstances. The door, as Hargreaves said, is already closed from the inside, independently of anything you do or don't do. The agent at the Grapes, Hargreaves says, almost certainly doesn't know this. His employer may not know it either. Which means the meeting he wanted me to arrange, which I was supposed to be the key to, is already unmeetable. Yes. Which means what he has over me can't deliver what he needs from me. Yes. Which means... It doesn't end there, Hargreaves says. For now, remains in the conversation. He may find another use for what he has, against you or against someone else. But it does change the immediate calculation significantly. He looks at the fire, and there is another element. You wait. A member of the Finance Committee who conducted the investigation, Hargreaves says, is someone I've known for many years. He is cautious about many things. But I spoke with him this week, carefully, about the nature of certain approaches to vulnerable individuals that have become associated with the organisation in Bermondsey. A pause. He's aware that this is not the first time the man's agent has used this particular kind of pressure. There are others who have been approached similarly. No names given, no specifics, but the pattern is known. You look at him. He's blackmailing multiple people. It would appear so, which is its own kind of double-edged situation. On one hand, it means the information he holds is necessarily diffuse, spread across multiple people, which makes it harder to deploy against any one of them decisively. On the other, it means he has a business that depends on this, which makes him more committed to it than someone with a single grievance. What did the Finance Committee member say? He said. Hargreaves pauses, choosing his words with particular care. He said that if any of the people who had been approached were willing to communicate the nature of the approach to him, it would be useful for the larger investigation into the organisation. He said this would require courage, and that he understood if courage was not available. And he said that anything communicated to him would be held with the same discretion he has applied to the investigation generally. The fire is steady. Outside, the Bloomsbury streets are quiet. A carriage passes. He's offering a way out, you say. He's offering the possibility of one, with the risk of a different exposure, but to someone who has... Hargreaves chooses his word. Sympathies that make the risk considerably smaller than it appears on the surface. Who is he? Hargreaves gives you the name. You know it. Not personally. You've never met the man. But you know who he is in the diocese. Know his reputation as someone precise and fair and incorruptible in the financial sense. You don't know anything about his sympathies, in the way Hargreaves seems to mean the word. I trust your judgment, you say. I know you do, he says, which is why I want to be explicit. This is a risk I cannot fully calculate for you. It requires you to tell someone in authority something that is currently only suspected. The benefit is the possibility of removing a permanent threat. The cost is making a disclosure that, to a different kind of person, would have devastating consequences. And this person is not that kind of person. I believe not. I have known him for many years, and I have reason to believe this strongly. A pause. But I want to be clear that believe and know are different words. You sit with this for a while, the fire, the sherry, the study full of books containing arguments about what things mean and what they require. Is there a version of this, you say, where Edmund is protected? Hargreaves looks at you. Edmund Calder, you say, who was also approached. He doesn't have what I have. No institutional position, no clerical collar, no relationship with the diocese. He's more exposed than I am in certain ways and less in others. If I make this disclosure and it leads anywhere, I need to know whether the man you're describing to the Finance Committee's member is the same man who approached Calder. Yes? If he is, Hargreaves says, then the disclosure that removes the threat for you also removes it for Calder. They're the same business. He looks at you steadily. And I suspect you know that the man at the grapes is the same agent for both. I suspect it too, you say. I want to be certain. Get me a letter from Calder describing the approach he received. The details. I'll compare it to what I have. If they match, then any communication to the Finance Committee member would address both simultaneously. How long does that take? A week, perhaps, possibly less. You nod. You spend the walk home constructing the sentence you will use to ask Edmund for the letter. This requires care. A letter from Edmund describing the approach he received is a document that exists, that can be found in the wrong circumstances and used in a way that exposes him. The way you ask for it needs to make the risk and the purpose completely clear, and it needs to be a choice he makes fully understanding both. You go to Clerkenwell the next morning, Saturday, when you know he'll be there. The clerk at Finch and Brother looks slightly more familiar with you this time and fetches Edmund without comment. You walk to the green again and you explain it. All of it. Hargreaves's findings, the Finance Committee, the offer, what you're asking for and why, the risks in both directions. You do not simplify any of it. Edmund walks slowly while you talk. His hands are in his coat pockets. When you finish, he's quiet for perhaps 30 seconds. If I write this letter, he says, and it goes where you're describing, to someone senior in the diocese, it goes to Hargreaves, who decides how and whether to transmit it to the Finance Committee member. You write to Hargreaves, not to the committee member directly. One more layer between you and the institution. And if it goes wrong, then it goes wrong, and you are in a worse position than you are now. You look at him. I'm not going to tell you the risk is small. It isn't. I'm telling you that I believe, based on what Hargreaves knows, that the person at the end of this particular chain is someone who can be trusted with it. He looks at the green. A group of children are throwing something to each other across the grass, some improvised game, their shouts clear in the cold morning air. The sky is overcast but dry, the kind of London grey that has no particular ambition to be anything else. You trust Hargreaves, he says, completely. And he trusts the Finance Committee man, with significant confidence. Edmund watches the children on the green for another moment. I'll write the letter, he says, tonight, if you can give me a direction for Hargreaves. You give him the Bloomsbury address. Walking back to St. Giles, you find yourself thinking about the structure of trust, how it works, how it is built, which is slowly, through small demonstrations over time, the consistency of behaviour, the accumulating record of someone doing what they say they will do, and how it travels, which is differently. How you can trust someone you haven't met because you trust the person who trusts them. How the network extends outward beyond your own direct experience. This is what the church is supposed to be, you think. Not the institution with its committees and its appointments and its careful management of reputation. The actual thing underneath. The network of people who trust each other enough to pass the essential things between them, carefully, in good faith, across the distances and the dangers. You think about the disciples mending their nets. The nets are for catching things, and for holding them once caught, and for mending when they tear. Edmund's letter arrives at your lodgings on Monday, addressed to you, with a note saying, "Please deliver to Canon Hargreaves at your earliest convenience." You don't read it. It is sealed, and it is not yours to read, and you deliver it to Hargreaves's house on Monday afternoon, when you're walking from one sick visit to another, and can route through Bloomsbury without significant detour. Hargreaves receives it with the equanimity he brings to all things, and says he'll be in touch within the week. The week passes in the ordinary way of weeks, which is to say, not at all ordinary, but composed of things that have the texture of ordinary. The sick visits and the catechism and the correspondence about the vestry roof and the burial, on Wednesday, of a young woman aged 23 of puerperal fever, which is a kind of death that always leaves you with a specific combination of grief and fury, because you know, in the way any thinking person in 1854 is beginning to know from the work of Semmelweis and others, that this death is preventable, that the doctors who attended this young woman did not wash their hands, that the medical establishment continues to resist the evidence of its own procedures with a stubbornness that costs lives at a rate you find it difficult to think about clearly. You conduct the burial with the full attention it deserves. Her husband stands at the grave and does not cry. He holds the baby, 3 weeks old, wrapped in everything he could find to wrap it in, and he doesn't cry. And the baby sleeps through its own mother's burial, which might be mercy. You say the words, you mean them, as you always mean them, in sure and certain hope. The certain hope that is, theologically, the hope that holds even when nothing else does. On Friday, Hargreaves sends a note. Come Saturday morning, you go Saturday morning. He is in the study, standing at the window, looking out at the garden. The fruit tree has the very first suggestion of bud at the tips of its branches, the first tentative gesture towards spring. He turns when you come in. Sit down, he says. You sit. He remains standing for a moment, then sits as well. I've spoken with the finance committee member, he says. And? The letters, yours and Calder's, corroborate each other precisely. The agent is the same man. The approach is the same approach. The timing suggests a systematic campaign rather than opportunistic targeting. He looks at you carefully. The finance committee member has taken this to the bishop. Your stomach drops in a way that is both predictable and still somehow shocking. The bishop, you say, not about you or Calder, not about what was used as leverage, about the organisation and its agent and the pattern of approaches. He looks at you. He's a careful man. He's been careful about this. The matter before the bishop is the charitable organisation's improper conduct, which includes suborning clergy and lay people through blackmail. The mechanism of the blackmail, what was held over people, is described in terms of personal information obtained by surveillance, without specifying its nature. So no one in the bishop's office knows. No one who didn't already know, and who wasn't already. He pauses, chooses, disposed of discretion about it. You are quiet. The finance committee member, you say finally, he knows from the letters. He does, and he's made it very clear in terms that I consider unambiguous that he considers the law that makes this information dangerous to be badly constructed, that the use of it as leverage is a moral crime that dwarfs the underlying fact, and that he intends to treat this matter entirely in terms of the blackmail operation rather than its instruments. A pause. He also said, and I'm going to quote this precisely because I want you to have the actual words, "Tell your curate that the work he does in that parish is known to us, and that we are not in the business of losing good priests because the law hasn't caught up with the gospel yet. You sit there, the fire in the grate, the study full of books, the garden outside with its first tentative buds. You're aware of your own breathing for a moment. The simple mechanical fact of it, air moving in and air moving out, the most fundamental process of being alive. Something that has been tense for 3 weeks releases, not all at once, not dramatically, not with any visible change, but releases the way a held breath releases slowly and completely." He said that, you say. Those words. Yes. You look at the fruit tree in the garden for a while. And the man at the grapes, you say, eventually, is the subject of a communication to the police, not from the diocese, from the finance committee member in his private capacity, citing the evidence of the blackmail operation. It will take time. These things always take time, but the mechanism has been put in motion. And until then? Until then, Hargreaves says with his steady grey eyes, you continue doing what you're doing, which is more valuable than this man imagined when he decided you were a convenient instrument for his purposes. You stand. You walk to the window and look out at the garden. The bud on the fruit tree is so small it is barely there. A reddening at the tip of the branch, a thickening, the most preliminary possible suggestion of what it will become. "There's something I want to ask you," you say, without turning from the window, "and you don't have to answer it." "Ask," he says. "How long have you done this?" you say. "Navigated this particular geography, the space between what the church is and what it requires and what the law says and what you actually are." He's quiet for a long moment. "Since I was ordained," he sees, "so 27 years, though in the early years I did it very badly. I was frightened in a way that made me rigid, which is not the same as careful. Rigidity looks like caution, but it's actually a kind of paralysis, and it made me smaller than I needed to be." A pause. "I came to understand eventually that the alternative to paralysis was not recklessness. It was precision, knowing exactly what could be said, and to whom, and in what form, knowing who could be trusted and calibrating that trust correctly. Building a life that was," he searches for it, "large enough to be worth protecting." You turn from the window. "Was there someone," you say, "who helped you the way you're helping me?" He meets your gaze. "Yes," he says. "And is he?" "He died in 1841, at a reasonable age, of natural causes. He lived a full life." A pause. "His name was Arthur. He was a physician. He had the same quality of attention that I've tried, with varying success, to develop over the years. He taught me that the difference between a life worth living and a life that merely endures is not the absence of difficulty. It's the presence of people who see you. You stand by the window in Hargreaves's study on a Saturday morning in March 1854, with the first buds on the fruit tree and the fire behind you, and the smell of dried orange peel coming from the hall. And you think about people who see you. About Mrs. Kehoe with her Patience for Pilgrim's Progress, and her sharp question that wasn't a question, about Agnes Thorne and her ferocious intelligence, about Peter Sloane and the anacondas, about Edmund Calder at the White Bear in January, talking about Maurice's Ionios while the fog pressed against the windows, about your mother who wept at your ordination, about your father who shook your hand and said you would do well, about Hargreaves who said, "You're not alone in this," and meant it, and proved it, and continues to prove it. You think about the visible world and the world that runs underneath it, that is maintained by invisible labour, by the people who hold things together in ways that cannot be fully acknowledged, in the dark and the fog and the cold rooms, through all the Tuesday mornings and all the letters that arrive like stones. You think about what it costs to maintain two realities simultaneously, the one that can be shown to the world and the one that is actually true. And you think about the question of whether that cost is bearable, and what it means when it is. It is bearable. You know this. It is bearable because it is also full, because the work is real and the faith is real and the love in whatever form it takes in this world, in this year, with this particular law and this particular fog, is real. Because Agnes Thorne will grow up to be formidable and she will know that someone told her so. Because Peter Sloane might live and the anacondas will be waiting for him on the other side of the fever. Because Mrs. Kehoe has Faithful and Christian and the Slough of Despond for company on the long, slow road of her illness. Because the vestry roof will be repaired eventually, and the services will continue, and the words will be said over the dead and the living and the almost born. Thank you, you say to Hargreaves. For the second time in this particular crisis, and the 100th time in 19 months. He nods. He picks up his manuscript, the commentary on pneuma, spirit, what it means and has always meant. And the gesture says, in the way his gestures often speak more clearly than his words, "Go on now, go do the work. You go." The street outside his house on a Saturday morning in early March it's lifting. The sky hasn't decided to be anything yet, but there's a brightness in it, a diffuse and tentative brightness, the possibility of the day becoming something more than grey. The trees in the squares that line Bloomsbury are not yet in leaf, but have that particular readiness, that held-in-breath quality of the weeks before the breaking. A dog passes with enormous purpose, going somewhere important on its own agenda. Two women with shopping baskets discuss something with great animation at the corner of the square, their voices carrying without individual words. London, doing what London does. You walk south and east, back towards St. Giles and your lodgings and your cold room, and Mrs. Dowd's Cromwell and the afternoon ahead of you. The letter which you've been carrying in your coat pocket for 18 days is now not in your pocket. You put it in the fire at Hargreaves's because he offered the fire and because you realised as you stood there that there is no reason to keep carrying it. What it said is known. What it threatened has been addressed. What remains of it is only paper. The burning of the paper was quick and without ceremony. The way the burning of things that no longer need to be kept is always quick and without ceremony. The flame found the edge and moved, and then it was gone, and the weight that had been in your chest since Tuesday morning 2 weeks ago was not gone exactly, changed, transformed into something that is not weightless but is bearable, is the weight of a life rather than the weight of a threat, which are different things even when they press in the same place. You think about Edmund. You'll need to tell him. Not all of it. Not the finance committee and the bishop, which is Hargreaves's domain to communicate, or not communicate as he judges appropriate, but enough. That the situation has changed. that the door he was used as leverage against is already closed, that the agent's power is diminished, that there are people in the diocese who know and are, in Hargreaves's word, disposed to discretion, you'll find him. Clerkenwell, Monday morning. In the meantime, the afternoon. You stop on High Holborn at a tea stall and buy a cup of tea that is better than the coffee was 3 weeks ago. Actual tea, stewed but hot, bitter in the way tea becomes when it has been sitting, which is a different kind of bitter from bad coffee, more honest somehow. And you stand at the stall and drink it and watch the street. High Holborn on a Saturday afternoon. The traffic is heavy. Carts and carriers and the pedestrian press of people doing their weekend business, buying and selling and walking and arguing and living. A knife grinder sets up at the corner and his wheel produces a sound that carries over the general noise. A high, steady screech that is somehow not unpleasant from this distance, a kind of industrial singing. 2 men in good coats stand outside a solicitor's office in close conversation about something with legal gravity, their faces wearing the expression of men calculating risk. A child runs between the legs of adults with the complete confidence of someone who has not yet learned to be frightened of the world. You think about what Canon Hargreaves said. The law hasn't caught up with the gospel yet. You don't know when it will. You know, or you believe, which is not the same as knowing but is the closest thing available to you, that it will, that the distance between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be is not fixed, that it has moved in the past and will move again, that the movement is slow and contested and sometimes reversed, but that over the long view it has a direction. This is a theological position, not merely an optimistic one. It is the position that says the arc bends, not automatically, not without people pushing on it, but it bends. You finish your tea and give the cup back to the stall-keeper and continue south toward the church. The light through the stained glass at this hour, mid-afternoon, the sun at last finding sufficient angle to activate the colour, is extraordinary. You come into the nave through the vestry, and the first thing you see is the east window throwing its red and gold across the stone floor, in patterns that shift as slowly as the planet turns. You have seen this many times. It is always remarkable. It is the kind of beauty that refuses to become ordinary, that insists on being noticed each time, even when you are tired, and your left shoe is damp again, and your mind has been working hard on difficult things for 3 weeks. You stand in the nave and look at the light on the floor for a moment, and then you go into the vestry and you write a letter to the bishop's office about the confirmation classes, and 3 letters to church wardens about the vestry roof, and you prepare the readings for next Sunday and you do the work. The work is the thing. This has always been true and becomes more true the longer you are in this life. The work is what survives the crises. The work is what was there before the letter and will be there after. The children in the catechism class, the sick visits, the burials which are never finished because people continue to die, the baptisms which are also never finished, the ordinary endless commerce of a human community with its God, conducted through a man in a black coat who stands between them and the mystery and tries to be a clear enough window that the light comes through. You are a clear enough window, on good days, on most days. You work until the light fails, and then you light the lamp on the vestry desk, and you work a little longer, and then you lock the church and walk home through the early dark of London in March, the gas lamps already lit on the main streets, throwing their particular amber into the fog that is beginning to come in again from the east. Mrs. Dowd has made something with potatoes. Cromwell is in his chair. The world is as it was this morning, with a very small number of important things quietly different. 2 weeks later, you receive a note from Hargreaves. Brief, as his notes always are, economy being one of his virtues. The charitable organisation in Bermondsey has been refused funding by the diocese on grounds of procedural and financial irregularity. The investigation is ongoing. The unnamed agent at the Grapes has not been in contact with you since Thursday of the first week, which you interpret, in light of what you now know, as the silence of someone who has discovered that the leverage he holds cannot deliver what he needs and is recalibrating. Recalibration takes time. It is not resolution. But it is a different situation from 3 weeks ago, which is progress in the direction of resolution, which is enough. Peter Sloane gets better, not dramatically, not all at once, but over the following weeks the fever breaks, and the cough diminishes, and the doctor tells his mother, with the professional grudgingness of a man who prefers not to be surprised by recovery, that the boy appears to be through the worst of it. You are visiting when this news arrives, and Peter, who is sitting up in bed for the first time, says, "Can we do more anacondas now?" And you say yes, and you read the chapter on the anaconda's distribution across the river systems of South America, and the chapter on the anaconda's method of hunting, and the chapter on the anaconda's relationship with local human populations who variously fear and revere it, and somewhere in the chapter on revering it, Peter falls asleep with a genuine sleep, the good kind, the sleep of a body that is working properly at last. His mother, standing in the doorway, looks at her sleeping son and looks at you and says nothing. You say nothing either. Some things don't require language. Mrs. Kehoe, 3 days after that, dies quietly in the morning. You are there. Her priest has come. He came when the final stage became clear, and so the last rites are properly administered, the ones she would have wanted, and you stand near the window and watch and think about Pilgrim's Progress and Faithful, who was burned alive in Vanity Fair rather than deny his faith, and about Mrs. Kehoe saying he was a bit of a fool for not keeping his mouth shut, and about the affection she said it with, the absolute unapologetic affection of someone who has thought about it and decided that both things are true simultaneously, that Faithful was a fool, and that he was right, and that these are not contradictions. Spring arrives in the way it always arrives in London, not all at once, but as a series of small surrenders by the winter, each day giving a little more ground, until one morning you walk outside and the quality of the air is definitively different. Something has shifted in the chemistry of it, and the trees in the squares are improbably green, and a woman on the corner is selling bunches of violets, and even the Thames smells more of river and less of consequence. You find Edmund on a Tuesday in April, by accident, at a lecture at the Royal Institution on the properties of certain acids in chemical reaction with textile dyes, which is the kind of lecture that attracts printers and chemists and curious clerics with an interest in natural history, and which you are attending because you've been meaning to for 3 weeks, and tonight finally managed it. He is 2 rows ahead of you. You see the back of his dark head and his ink-stained hands and the quality of stillness with which he listens. Afterward, in the lobby, the crowd sorting itself toward the doors, you find each other in the way that 2 people who know they are looking for each other find each other in a crowd. Not dramatically, not with any visible searching, just the eyes landing and holding. You walk out together and turn east along Albemarle Street into the April evening. "I heard," he says. "From whom?" "Canon Hargreaves came to see me." "He did?" "Last week. He told me what there was to tell." A pause. He walks with his hands in his coat pockets, which you've noticed is his thinking posture. He's a very specific kind of person. Yes, you say, frightening in a way, in the best way. He considers this. He said something to me that I've been thinking about. Another pause. He said, "The work you do in your trade is work that matters. The text you set, the words you put into the world. Be precise with them. Precision is itself a moral act." He looks at you briefly. He didn't have to say that. "No," you say. "He chose to." "Yes." You walk. Albemarle Street gives onto Piccadilly, and the evening traffic is considerable. The usual arterial press of carts and carriages and pedestrians, the whole city flowing in its complicated directions. The shop windows are lit along the south side, the new gas lighting doing its work, making the goods behind the glass visible at this hour in a way that wasn't possible 20 years ago. You pass a bookshop and a linen draper, and a shop selling optical instruments, telescopes and microscopes in the window, the kind of objects that point you toward what is too large or too small to see with ordinary eyes. "The charge about the organisation in Bermondsey," Edmund says, "where does it go from here?" "I don't know fully," you say. "Hargreaves says the police are involved now in the matter of the blackmail operation. That takes time. It may amount to a prosecution, it may not." You consider how much you know and how much is yours to say. The immediate pressure is off, the longer resolution is, as these things are. "Ongoing," he says. "Yes." He nods. He looks at the optical instruments in the window as you pass them. "I've been thinking," he says, "about what he said. The agent at the grapes. For now." He pauses. "I understand why that terrified me. At the time, I understood it immediately. Because the 'for now' means the arrangement is open-ended. It means you never know when it ends, whether it ends, on what terms." He glances at you. "But I've been thinking that for now is actually how everything operates. All of this. Your position at St. Giles, my work at Finch and Brother, the arrangements that make the lives we actually live possible. All of it is for now. Not in the threatening sense. In the actual sense. Nothing is permanent. That's," you say. You think about it. "That's either consoling or terrifying depending on the day." "Yes," he says. "Both. Simultaneously." He's smiling slightly. You are smiling slightly. The April evening moves around you, mild, the smell of the city softened by the season. A group of young men erupts from a pub doorway, noise and colour, dispersing into the street. "The lecture was good," you say, "about the textile dyes." "Excellent," he says. "I didn't know about the mordanting process. The role of the mineral salt in fixing the colour permanently. It's essentially chemistry accomplishing what the dye alone can't, making it hold." "Yes," he says, "exactly." He says exactly with a precision that is, you think, one of the most recognisable things about him. The way he confirms agreement not with a polite sound, but with an actual word that means the specific thing, that doesn't oversell or undersell the match, but just meets it. You say, "I was thinking of going to look at the new fossil displays at the museum on Sunday. If you're not," "Yes," he says. "Not. Perhaps. Not. That might be interesting." "Yes." You walk a little further. The street lamps throw their warm light. London continues around you in its usual condition of magnificent impossibility. The dome of St. Paul's is visible above the roof line to the east, catching the last of the light. The familiar geometry of it, both large and graceful. The thing that you can always locate yourself by, that gives the city a navigable centre. You part at the corner of St. James's Street. He goes north toward Clerkenwell. You go east toward St. Giles. The departure is ordinary. A nod, a word, the appropriate social form. Nothing that means anything more to someone watching than two men who walked the same direction for a while. But you walk east with the fossil exhibition on Sunday in the front of your mind, a straightforward, uncomplicated pleasure, and the April air on your face, and the dome of St. Paul's ahead of you, and the feeling of someone who is going somewhere. The months turn. Summer comes to London with its annual cheerful brutality, the heat, the smell, the Thames at its worst, the cholera that moves through Soho in August with terrible efficiency until snow maps the pump handle on Broad Street, and the outbreak stops, and the medical establishment begins, reluctantly and slowly, to revise its understanding of how disease moves. You watch this from the edges, from the parish, from the sick visits. You pray with people who are frightened. You bury people who die. You argue theology with Agnes Thorne, who has started attending your catechism sessions less for the official content than for the arguments, which you suspect she regards as better than the content, and you can't entirely disagree. Hargreaves finishes the chapter of his commentary on the Pneuma in Galatians and reads it to you one Sunday afternoon in September, sitting in the study with the windows open to the autumn beginning in the garden. The chapter argues that what Paul means by spirit is not a supernatural addition to human nature, but the thing that is most essentially human, the capacity for relationship, for recognition, for seeing and being seen. The pneuma that binds communities together is not a different substance from the one that makes individual persons particular. It is, he argues, love, not as sentiment but as act, as recognition, as the specific work of attending to what is actually there rather than what is expected to be there. This will not be published in my lifetime, he says when he finishes. Probably not, you agree. It should be. He looks at you over his spectacles. 60 years from now, he says, someone will read it and think, obviously, and they'll be right. Truths usually seem obvious once enough people can see them. On a Monday morning in October, a letter arrives at your lodgings, not threatening, not demanding. From a compositor in Clerkenwell in handwriting that is precise and controlled and contains, in its formation, something of the person who formed it. It says simply, I found a book you mentioned, The Natural History of South America, first edition, good condition, for Peter Sloane, if you think he'd like it. E.C., you hold the letter and look at it for a while. You write back. He would like it very much. Bring it when you come on Sunday. There's a family of finches that is set up in the garden of St. Giles that the natural historian in question will need to observe first-hand. Come at 2. The book is brought on Sunday. Peter Sloane, 11 weeks recovered from his fever and returned to school and currently growing at a rate that is visible to anyone who has known him for longer than a month, receives it with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects, and then immediately opens it to the chapter on anacondas and begins asking Edmund questions that Edmund, to his credit and your amusement, answers with complete seriousness and considerable precision. His mother watches from the kitchen doorway. Later, when Peter has been absorbed back into the house and you and Edmund are walking back toward the church in the October afternoon, the air carrying the first cold edge of the coming season, the leaves beginning their concession to the year, you say, that was a kind thing to do. He says, he's a remarkable child. He is, you say. He's going to be formidable. He already is, says Edmund, and you look at him, and he looks at you. and both of you know you're quoting. Both of you know from where, and the recognition of it passes between you in the way that all recognition passes between people who've decided to be careful about what they say and precise about the small things, wordlessly, directly landing where it is meant to land and no further. London continues, the days continue, the work continues, the Crimean War continues, and Florence Nightingale writes her letters from Scutari, and the casualty lists are published in the Times and read by mothers in kitchens all across the country. Parliament debates, trains run, the Thames stinks, the East End grows, the missionaries go to Africa, the natural historians go everywhere and bring back evidence of a world more complicated and surprising and ancient than the Church's official account of creation has yet made room for. And this is a problem that is growing rather than shrinking, and will have to be addressed by someone eventually. Hargreaves continues writing the commentary on Numa, which will indeed not be published in his lifetime. Agnes Thorne, at 14, argues her way into the attention of the local schoolmaster, who has never taught a girl quite like this, and who tells you, slightly dazed, that she should be at one of the new girls' schools, somewhere she can be properly educated, and you agree and write 3 letters on her behalf, and she is enrolled at one in the spring. Mrs. Kehoe's room is taken by a young man from County Galway who's been in London for 3 weeks, and who is lost in the way that newly arrived people are lost. Not in space. He finds his way physically, but in the dense, invisible maps of this city, the rules and relationships that aren't written anywhere, that you learn only by being taught or by making expensive mistakes. You begin visiting him on Thursdays. You read to him from whatever he chooses. He chooses the first week, unexpectedly, a history of the Roman Empire, which he says he always wanted to understand but never had the book. You find him a better history. You read the parts about engineering. He's interested in engineering and asks questions about the aqueducts with the same ferocity Peter Sloane brings to anacondas. This is the work. This is always the work. On an evening in November, walking back from a late meeting of the church wardens about the vestry roof, which has been in negotiation for the better part of a year, and which appears to be approaching something like resolution, you pass a church you don't usually pass, a small one, older than St. Giles, tucked into a side street in a way that suggests it is slightly hiding from the neighbourhood, and through its open door you hear singing. Not the grand choral singing of the cathedral, or the proper congregational singing of a Sunday service. Just someone, by the sound of it, practising. A tenor voice, alone in the empty church, working through a phrase of something. You know what it is when you stop to hear it. It is Purcell, the same composer whose music set the windows vibrating on the morning you stood with your head against the cold vestry wall, reading the letter for the first time, and the phrase the voice is working through is, "O solitude, my sweetest choice." It is a song about choosing to be alone, about the solitude that is not loneliness, but the opposite, the fullness of interior life, the richness of the private world. You stand outside the open church door and listen for a moment. The voice works through the phrase again and again, perfecting some interval you can't quite identify, some modulation that requires repetition to get right. The church interior is dim from here, the candles on the altar the only light. The voice fills the stone space with something that the stone takes and amplifies and gives back changed, as stone always does. You listen until the phrase is right, until the voice gets the interval it was working toward, and then the singing stops, and there is just the quiet of the church and the quiet of the street and the quiet of a November evening in London, which is its own particular thing. Not silence, never silence, but the city breathing low in the way it does in the dark season. You walk on, home, through the familiar streets, the familiar smells. Mrs. Dowd's house, the smell of coal fire from the hall, Cromwell on the stairs, his usual posture of dignified inconvenience, the room upstairs, the desk, the bookcase, the keybill in the bottom drawer, and the notebook, and the letter that is no longer in the coat pocket. You sit at the desk and open the notebook. In the private compressed script you write, "There is a tenor practising Purcell in a church on Sergeant's Inn. I don't know his name. It was very beautiful." You close the notebook. You look at the wall for a while, in the way you do when your mind has reached something it wants to sit with rather than move through. Through the floor you can hear Mrs. Dowd moving in the kitchen below some evening task, the particular rhythmic sounds of domestic life. The coal in the small grate makes its quiet adjustments. Somewhere outside a cart passes late. This is what remains at the end of a difficult year. The work, the people, the small room, the city, the winter beginning, and you, intact, still here, the person you were when you arrived, and the person you're becoming, neither cancelled out by the other. The Church of England in 1854 is a complex and various institution, simultaneously housing men like the Bishop's Finance Committee member, who says the law hasn't caught up with the gospel, and men who would agree with that statement in ways they cannot currently say aloud, and men who would be horrified by it, and men who have never thought about it at all, because the question of what the gospel actually requires has not yet made its way to the particular shelf where they keep their beliefs. It is an institution built on compromise and maintained by the labour of an enormous number of people who give it more than it gives them, and it fails its people in ways that are sometimes catastrophic, and sometimes merely chronic, and sometimes so ordinary as to be invisible. And it is also the thing that makes it possible for you to stand at a graveside and say words that mean something to a man holding a 3-week-old baby in a grief he can't yet carry. It is the thing that puts you in a room with Agnes Thorne's ferocious questions. It is the thing that sent you to Mrs. Kehoe and the slough of despond and the argument about faithful. Both things are true. You are learning, with increasing skill, to hold both things in your hands simultaneously without dropping either. You blow out the candle. The room is dark, just the faint light of the gas lamp on the street coming in through the curtain. Tomorrow is Tuesday, the sick visits, the catechism on Friday, a letter to write to the church wardens, the final one, the one that should seal the arrangement about the roof. Sunday there is a baptism in the afternoon. Tomorrow Edmund will be at Finch and Brother on Clerkenwell Close, setting type with his precise hands, putting words into the world with the care that Hargreaves told him was a moral act. And Hargreaves will be in his study writing about the spirit that binds people together, and Agnes Thorne will be at her desk at the girls' school 3 streets away learning something she will use to change something you can't yet predict. And Peter Sloane will be recovering the way young bodies recover, which is faster and more completely than seems quite credible. And somewhere in Suffolk a man who wrote a letter that said, "I know what you are," is finding that knowing and leverage are different things. And a tenor in a church off Sergeant's Inn, whose name you don't know, is learning a phrase of Purcell in the dark. And all of it will continue tomorrow, and all of it will continue after that, in the inexorable and sometimes unjust and sometimes luminous way that things continue, through all the seasons and all the changes and all the years that are coming, that none of you can see yet from here. Let that be enough for tonight. Let it be enough to have been here, in this specific November, in this specific city, in this specific body, doing this specific work. Let the weight of the year be also the weight of what you've built with it. The skills learned, the people known, the prayers said over the living and the dead, the small and private and essential things. You are warm enough, safe enough, fed enough. You have a roof, your own, and the church's, the one that is finally being repaired, and work that matters, and people who see you, and a notebook at the bottom of a drawer, and a book of poetry that you read when no one is watching, and somewhere across the city through the November dark, a man with ink-stained hands who said yes to Sunday and meant it. That's enough. More than enough. Let the city carry on below you. Let the carts and the horses and the gas lamps and the fog and the singing in the empty churches and the questions that won't be answered yet carry on. Let London be what London is, magnificent and terrible and indifferent and full of life and full of death and full of people trying to get through their days the same as you. Let yourself sink into the rest you've earned. Tomorrow the bells will ring at 8 o'clock from St. Giles in the Fields, as they have rung for 300 years, as they will ring for 300 more. Tomorrow the work will be waiting. Tomorrow the world will make its usual claims on you, and you will meet them, as you've been meeting them, with the whole person that you are. But tonight is just this. The dark room and the city breathing outside and the long, slow descent into sleep. The way sleep comes when you finally let it. When you stop running the calculations and let the day become what it is. Past, completed, done, surrendered. Your eyes grow heavy. The November dark holds you. Somewhere, very distant, the church bell strikes a late hour. You count the strokes without trying to, because that's what you do. Because the bells have been marking time in this neighbourhood for centuries, because the habit of listening to them is deeper than any single year. 11. London breathes. You breathe. The person you are lies in a cold room in a November city in a year the world will mostly forget. In a life that is invisible to history, but visible to the people who matter. And that is enough, and always was enough, and will continue to be enough long after this particular night has passed and become another Tuesday, and another November and another year. The bells fade. The dark is complete. Sleep comes, as it comes to everyone who has worked hard and loved what they do, and been afraid and kept going anyway. It comes slowly. It comes kindly. It comes the way all the important things come in the end. Not announced, not dramatic, just present, just there, just the quiet, reliable fact of rest arriving at the end of a day that needed it. Let it take you. You've earned this. Good night.